I'm Timothy Holt, the youth pastor at 6 Points Church here in Western Pennsylvania. The address is Parker, Pennsylvania. But due to recommendations by Governor Wolf and our state overseer, Bishop Mackey, we are not meeting at our building, so I'm live streaming from my living room in Eau Claire. So I've been doing that for several weeks. If you're not familiar with what's going on with this virus originating in China called COVID-19, I'm not going to get you caught up to speed. But hopefully we can start meeting back in our building soon. That would be great. If you want to keep the live stream going and have me continue it, let me know. I'm willing to do that. Real quick shout out to our cameraman, which is actually Tori. She's one of our teenagers at 6 Points. She's going to be covering the camera work as well as the discussion. So leave comments, questions, if you have anything you want to talk about. Put them in the comment section and she will let me know, because I don't have a monitor in front of me, so I can't do that right away. Let's see, what else? Am I missing any other announcements? I don't think so. So, do we have anybody watching?
No.
Well, no one.
I don't know. How do you tell?
Hold on. It'll tell right there. That little eyeball. With 4. So we have 4 people watching. All right. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. Let me know. We definitely want good audio as well as video footage. So last week we concluded our in-depth study of the book of Proverbs, which is one of the wisdom books in the Bible. And it was brought to my attention by a few different people that an overview of the Bible might be beneficial simply for, as the description says, for those who have been studying the Bible for many years. I learned how to read. I remember using the Authorized King James Version of the Bible to learn how to read in preschool and kindergarten. Yeah, that tells you a little bit about my parents. But it wasn't the only book. I should clarify, that's not the only book that I learned how to read with, but I do remember learning how to read using it. Or you are brand new to this whole Christian thing and you have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about different books of the Bible. This would probably be good for you. We are going to just do a rough overview of the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible, as you can see, is big. Contains 66 books. So that's why we read it and study it. This is just to give an overview for the next hour or so on what it is, how it's broke down, and working your way around it. So I do have some notes tonight. Unlike previous live streams, you'll probably notice in the previous live streams, my notes were the chapter that we were talking about in the book of Proverbs. Tonight, because we're doing a little bit more history and overview, I actually have some notes. This is going to get ported over to YouTube at 90 and out sometime later this week or next week. And in the description there, I will put the sources for where I'm citing, okay? If you want to know them. So, are you ready? By the way, if you hear anybody chewing, usually we have food on Wednesday nights. So we have a shrimp scampi tonight. So you might hear that in the background. We have Dorothy here. Is it good? Does it taste good? She's shaking her head no, but she's got a big grin on her face. So I'm going to wait until after live stream because I find it quite rude to talk and eat at the same time with my mouth full. So, all right, let's get to it. No comments yet? All right. In that case, I'm going to start with my notes. basic breakdown of the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible contains 66 books, and they're set up in two sections. The first section is the Old Testament, and then the New Testament. Testament comes from the word testify. It's simply a statement or someone's story. In this case, it's the story. The Old Testament covers the story of the ancient Israelites, and the New Testament covers the origins of Christianity through Jesus of Nazareth. So, the Old Testament is broken down, those 39 books are broken down even further into some sections. By the way, are there any Jews in our live stream? If you are Jewish, let me know in the comments, because the Old Testament for Christians is the same texts as the Tanakh for Jews. It's just set up or arranged slightly differently. I say slightly differently, it's not really slightly, it's quite different. The first 5 books are the same. They're known as the Law, or the Pentateuch, or Pentateuch. I mispronounce that word a lot. It starts with Penta, meaning 5, and Tach, which is books. So it's the Law. It's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also known as the books of Moses, because most of it was written and compiled by Moses. I say most of it because in Deuteronomy it covers the death of Moses, and clearly he couldn't write it if he's dead. So somebody later added that at the end of Deuteronomy covering his death as kind of a aftermarket addition, if you will. It's clearly, if you read that last chapter of Deuteronomy, it's clearly written well after the fact. So, for those of you who are like, hey, Moses couldn't write Deuteronomy because he's dead. Yeah, Deuteronomy says that. They actually say, hey, we're writing after the fact about his death. So, I find that fascinating about that. Just wanted to let you know that I find it fascinating when I come across that section, or a section like that, where a scribe, usually scribes, they were professionals. They would collect scrolls and hand copy them. And they come back and say, hey, I'm scribe so-and-so, and I'm writing this for whatever reason. And I just find that pretty fascinating. Then we have histories. In the Christian world, we have the histories. If you're Jewish, I believe that also includes the letters of the prophets. For Christians, we separate them into 2 other sections. But from what I've seen with the Jewish Tanakh, is that's all compiled into one section. So that's Joshua through Esther, and that covers, well, they read like history book. So if you like to read history books, these are your books. Okay. They cover from the Exodus out of Egypt, basically the crossing of the Jordan into the Promised Land, what we know of as Israel right now, Judea, all the way to Esther, which is about 400 BC before Christ. And yeah, they cover Joshua, which is the conquest of Canaan, the Judges, which is before they had kings. And then you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They cover, well, the kings, the unified kingdom, as well as Judah and Israel being separate kingdoms. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther cover while they are in exile or conquered by other countries. Namely the Babylonians and the Persians. The Babylonians are also known as Medes, by the way. So you may have heard of the Medes in history class. Babylonians, Medes, yeah, same people. And then Ruth is in there, and Ruth doesn't read like a history book. Ruth sticks out. It's a history book, but it reads more like a romance novel. I'm kind of surprised I'm not getting an odd look by Tori with that. But Ruth is 4 chapters long, and it covers a lady named Ruth and her family, Naomi, as well as her husband Boaz, and how they became husband and wife. It's kind of a cool story. It sets up the line of David, and that storyline we see in the Kings and Chronicles, but it's just kind of there. So if you want a short little romance story, Ruth is your book. Then we have the books of poetry or the books of wisdom. And that would be Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. The Jewish Psalms and poetry is the same books. They're just, again, set up differently, with Psalms being the first one, and then Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. Proverbs, we covered those videos. You can check out 90 and Out playlist with our live streams for the book of Proverbs. And then Job covers a man named Job. Some people pronounce it Job. Every time I hear somebody pronounce it Job, because it's J-O-B, I kind of get a chuckle. Either way, whether you pronounce it Job or Job, you got to have one. And the Christian Bible has it right there in the middle. It covers his life, and it plays out more like a play, in my opinion, than more of a story. So, but it is poetry. Ecclesiastes is written from an old man's perspective, and the general theme there is everything is vanity and there's nothing new under the sun. Song of Solomon, how should I put this? Song of Solomon is the porno of the Bible. Yes, I'm going to get some jaw dropping on that. Okay. Read it. If you doubt me, just read it. It's blushing, it's gushy, it's very sexually oriented. That's your book, okay? Now, what?
Nothing.
For you teenagers, if you want to study Song of Solomon, I have no problem doing that. However, I have done an in-depth study of Song of Solomon on 90 and Out. You can check out those videos. But it is definitely, yeah, that's how to look at it. Psalms is actually 5 books. So I probably knew that a long time ago, but recently I came across that. But it's 5 books compiled into one large book called Psalms, or the Songs, and they were generally sung. So think of old hymns, things of that nature. Also, as a note for Psalms, during the Middle Ages, if you were Catholic, the Catholic Church would only allow songwriters to use the Bible in their songs, in their singing. So the book of Psalms is where they went to most of the time. So 5 books, they're numbered 1 through 5, and they cover different elements of the Jewish people. There's David is the most popular writer. He's not the only one, but he is handedly the most popular, with over 30 of them being credited to him. But there's also Psalms written by people we don't know. They're of unknown authorship. So that's kind of neat. Then we have major prophets and minor prophets, closing out the Old Testament. Major prophets are not because they're more important. Did you know that, Tori?
Why?
Exactly. Yes. Even when we're sitting here, sometimes we space off.
Major prophets and they're not more important.
Major prophets are not called major prophets because they're more important. They're called major prophets because their books are bigger. It's simply because they're longer. We have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel. Lamentation is written by Jeremiah, and it's a tear-jerk fest. There's no other real nice way of putting it. It gets its name Lamentation because he's lamenting. He's full of sorrow. It's a pretty sad, depressing book. So if you want to read something that's depressing, Lamentation is your book. Because it is depressing to read that book. Informative, it's a good read, but it's a depressing one. But they're simply longer. And then the minor prophets are Hosea through Malachi. And they are called minor prophets because they're shorter in length. They're just not as long. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament is separated a little differently. Yeah, we've got tons of time. New Testament is where Christians get their bread and butter. Because the Old Testament is great. It covers the history of the Jewish people. And I have it under pretty good authority that this guy named Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew. He was a Jew. Just in case you didn't know that, in case there's some Christians out there that might want to ignore that fact, he was a Jew. And that's where the New Testament comes in. We skip 400 years in time from the Malachi, closing of Malachi, to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to Jesus. It's approximately 400 years. Okay? Real quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's not that there weren't things being written or things happening during that 400 years, because there were. It's just that the Christian Bible usually doesn't contain any books covering that time period. I say usually because there are some that do. And that's called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is 15 books, give or take. And the reason I say give or take is because depending on who you ask, depends on which books are included in the Apocrypha. There's no real consensus. And that's why most Bibles, most Christian Bibles, don't include the books. It's simply because there's not a large consensus of which ones to add and which ones not to. They include like the first and second Maccabees, which are history books, Tobit, which reads like a biography, and others. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because there's not a lot to say about them other than, yes, they exist. Some people like them, some people don't, and there's 15 of them. Some are more popular than others, like the Maccabees, and some are not popular at all, like Ezra. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's not Ezra. That's actually in the Bible, in the Old Testament. It's like a combination of Esther and Ezra together. So weird spelling. But 400 years, we got the New Testament. And the New Testament starts with Matthew, ends with Revelation. It's not Revelations, it's Revelation, singular. And there's a little less breakdown. So we have the biographies, also known as the Gospels, or the Gospel, meaning good news. And that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. What can I say about them? Oh, yeah. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels because they have a lot of similarities and cover a lot of the same events. I think somewhere between the neighborhood of 80 and 90% of the same events. Almost everything covered in Mark is covered in Matthew and Luke. Mark is the shortest of the four gospels, and it reads like an action-adventure story. Mark definitely concentrates on the action. Matthew has the longest speeches recorded by Jesus with the Sermon on the Plain and the famous Sermon on the Mount. So he's definitely more speech-oriented. Luke was a doctor, and his gospel covers more of the miracles. John was written for a person. It was commissioned, which was not uncommon in ancient history, for a scribe to be commissioned to compile a history. Polycarp, Justinian, they were all paid by wealthy rulers and aristocrats to write their histories. John is written by that. Actually, if you open up the book of John, it says right at the beginning, John, we've got in the beginning, was it John? Maybe, hold on.
Wasn't in the beginning Genesis 1:1?
No, John starts out that way too. There's it here. Oh no, wrong one. John ends with, there's so much more that could be written, it's not here. One of them was written for a person. Hold on. I'm going to find it real quick, or it's going to bug me. If you know off the top of your head, feel free to comment. Are there any comments? None? Really?
Just me.
Wow. Usually we have a lot of comments this far into it. Ooh. Luke. Sorry. Wasn't John, it was Luke. Luke was commissioned, the book of Luke was commissioned to be written for Theophilus. I don't know who that guy is, but he must have had some money, and he is credited with paying for the book of Luke to be compiled and written. So, wrong one. But that's the Gospels. Then we have the history. Some people don't separate the two. They just go the histories, meaning the biographies, and the history book of Acts. The book of Acts is by itself, and the reason is because it's Luke part 2. So if you read the Gospel according to Luke, and then just continue on in the book of Acts, it just continues on, like to be continued, and hey, here's part 2. And it covers the first century church and the establishment of Christianity. The first half covers the apostles being led by Peter, and the second half covers branching out into the Gentiles or non-Jewish people with Paul. So then we have the next section, which is the Paul's letters or Pauline letters, and they're not books. I know that might sound strange to non-Christians or even some Christians when we say 66 books, but they're not books. They're letters, and they're written like letters. I know, Tori, you probably haven't written a letter in your life because there's email now.
I've written a letter. More than one.
But there's instant messenger and email and text. And Snapchat. I was actually with a coworker, and I didn't know you can call people with Snapchat.
Mm-hmm.
Her phone just started going, Snapchat phone call, Snapchat audio, Snapchat video. It was annoying to her as well as to me. But yeah. But Paul wrote letters, lots of them, to churches and to people. So the first group is to churches, to the Christians in that city. So Romans is written to. Any guesses, Story? Who Romans was written to? It was to the Romans. Yeah, it was to Christians in Rome.
Who would have ever thought?
Yeah. Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, were 2 letters written to the Christians in Corinth. Yeah, we are so creative on naming books, huh? Not really, no. And then there's personal letters. And the personal letters were written to pastors and deacons in those cities, with the exception of Philemon. Philemon was written to a guy named Philemon, and it is a very personal letter written about a guy named Onesimus, and it's about a slave. Yes, slavery is covered in the Bible, and slaves were common in the Roman Empire. So Paul writes a letter to a guy named Philemon, who is a wealthy Christian, and says, hey, I came across your runaway slave, and I'm sending him back to you, but I don't want you to welcome him back as a slave. I'd much rather you welcome him back as a son, an heir to your estate. He's been a great guy. It's a very short letter. It's a cool read. Paul even says if he's screwed you over in any way, owes you any money, let me know and I will pay everything. So also the reason I say Philemon sticks out too is because it's the only book, the only letter Paul wrote where he does not overtly reference the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Hi, Victoria. The other Victoria, right? Hi. Hi, Victoria. But Philemon is the only one where Paul does not overtly reference the resurrection of Jesus in it. And I think that's because he is standing in the gap for Onesimus, like Jesus stands in the gap for us. So he's exemplifying it rather than saying it. And then we have general letters. General letters are Hebrews through Jude, and they are just that. They're just general letters to the church. So if you're familiar with the Church God of Prophecy, we have headquarters in Cleveland, Tennessee, and a general overseer that kind of oversees everything. So it would be like our general overseer writing a letter to all of the churches in our organization. And that's what these letters are basically. We have 3 from Peter, or 2 from Peter, we have 3 from John, we have 1 from a guy named Jude, and then we have Hebrews. A lot of people think that Hebrews was written by Paul, and some people list that in the Paul's letters. However, Hebrews is unknown authorship. It looks like it could be Paul, but there's no definitive answer that it was. So so I'm not going to put it with Paul's because I don't know for sure it was. And then we have the last book in the Bible, which is Revelation, and it is prophecy, and it's its own beast. Yes, pun intended there, because there is a beast in Revelation that plays a main role. So that is an overview of the Bible for the first half of our live stream. I'm looking at the clock, which is up there, because for the second half, we're going to cover why we should care about these ancient texts, okay, and what it means. So here's just some facts I'm going to throw out for you about the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible starts with the beginning of recorded history, with the origin, known as Genesis, and goes all the way up to about 70 AD. Okay, between 70 and 100 AD after that. So that's about 2,500 years of history, human history. It was written by over 40 different people during that time frame. The oldest copy we have dates back to about 500 BC, 500 before Christ. So that's about 2,500 years ago. Most English translations. Yeah.
Nothing.
You can interrupt. I'm okay with it. I like discussion. So.
No, it's fine. Keep going.
Okay. All right, we're going to keep going. She's being goofy. All right. The most popular Christian Bible was the King James Version, or the Authorized Version, originally printed in 1611 by the English King James, thus called the King James Version. It's not the only printing. It had a couple of revisions, once in the late 1800s and also once in the 1700s. But it is the most popular or most common, mainly because, well, it's still being printed today. and that's 400 years later. So it does read like it was written in 1611. So if you're a fan of, say, like Shakespeare, King James Version is going to read very similar, simply because of the language. Originally, it was written in 3 different languages. Hebrew, which is what almost all of the Old Testament was written in. Aramaic, some parts of the Old Testament, as well as some of the New Testament, was written in Aramaic. Notably, the book of Daniel. And Greek. Almost all of the New Testament was written in Greek. Now, I've had some debates with people on that. The reason we say Greek is because most of the oldest copies we have are written in Greek. And Greek was the common written language of the time period in that location, in Judea. Yes, it was part of the Roman Empire, and Latin was the language of the Roman Empire, but that was for the law. That was not the common language. There was a variant of Aramaic that was commonly spoken at that time, but it was not a common written language. So Greek was the common written language throughout the Roman Empire, and so it makes sense that if you're spreading this religion and writing this stuff down, you would write it in the language that is the most readily available for the most people. So that would have been Greek. Hi, Megan. Glad you joined us. So, the Old Testament was compiled over several hundred years, with what we know as the Old Testament being really solidified around 200 BC. So what we have as the Old Testament is what Jesus, as well as the apostles and the first century church, would have used as their Bible, as the Tanakh. So it was generally accepted, it was copied, and again, that's where the scribes come in, because that was their main job. The New Testament, on the other hand, is a different story. And the reason I say that from a historical standpoint is because instead of taking several hundred years to formulate, it took about 150 years to get what we have as the New Testament settled. And the reason I say that is because just some dates to throw out here. We have the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth taking place in 30 AD. We have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And almost all of the writings for the New Testament date to between 30 AD and 70 AD as when they take place. I say almost all of it because the book of Revelation, again, is its own beast. Some of that may or may not have been written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But we know that all of the letters of Paul, the general letters, the Gospels, and the book of Acts are in that time frame. Okay? That 40 years. And the letters of Paul were not written by Paul. They were written by a scribe. Paul did know how to read and write. However, due to persecution and several attempts on his life, being shipwrecked, and other trauma that he sustained in his life, he most likely did not actually write them himself. And the reason I say that is because in Philemon, there's a section in Philemon where he says, Philemon, I'm writing this with my own hand. I will pay any debt owed. So the rest of Philemon was written by a scribe. In 300, so John, the death of John is about 100 AD. 325 AD is the Council of Nicaea. as well as several other councils leading up to that. So those are all really quickly in that time period. Archaeology. This is the history part of the class. All right. The Dead Sea Scrolls, very famous set of scrolls, ancient scrolls. They are 99.5% identical to the same text that King James provided to the 200 scribes and historians he hired to compile the King James Version of the Bible. 99.5% identical to those texts. That's remarkably close. That's 400 years difference. Okay. There's 1,000-year-old manuscripts from 500 AD to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're 99.5% identical. That 0.5% difference is sentence structure and spelling differences. So, like John, John, versus John, Jon. I don't find that to be very significant differences. However, I find it highly significant that that's the only differences. That's impressive. Pastor Diana, wave. Okay, hi, Pastor Diana. So this is where I'm going to be concluding talking about this. Right here, I'm going to show some differences. So we have Plato's The Republic, which covers the Greek Republic. It is dated 380 BC. The oldest copy we have in archaeology, known copy, dates back to 900 AD. That's a difference of 1,300 years. So the oldest copy we have is 1,300 years removed from the events that it covers. Okay? Tori, would you like to get a guess of how many copies of Plato's The Republic we have? Ancient copies. A little more than that. We have more than one. A little more.
5.
You're close because it's less than 10. We have 7 archaeological copies of Plato's The Republic. 7 copies. Okay? However, it is widely accepted as historical and the Republic existed. Okay? And reliable. Caesar's Galaic Wars. That would be the history of Caesar's wars in Gaul. That includes him going into Britannia, modern Britain, Germany, France, all of that. It's called the Galaic Wars. It's dated 100 to 44 BC. So, Tori, since you're the only one in person, actually, we'll give... How many people are there? How many people we got watching? 8. All right, we're going to give you 8 people about a minute or so. And how many copies of the Galaic Wars do you think, ancient copies, do you think we have in museums around the world? And how old do you think the oldest one is? We got somebody who says 4? Oh, we got a guess of 4. Go ahead. Give me some comments. Guess how many we have in museums around the world, known copies, and how old do you think they are? We'll give you about a minute here. What's your guess, Tori?
1.
Okay, we got a guess of 1, we got a guess of 4. How old do you think it is? The oldest one we got.
1 billion.
No, the oldest. What year?
I don't know.
Nobody gonna guess?
Pastor Diana said 5 copies, 500 years old.
5 copies and 500 years old. So
Megan says 20 copies, 190 years old. I say 4 copies, probably about 600 years old.
all right. Guess what? We have 10 known copies. Okay. And the oldest one is dated to 1000 AD. So that would be 1,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it's covering the Galaic Wars, which predate Jesus by about 100 years. Okay? So 100 BC, the oldest copy we got is 1,100 years later. What?
Megan says, I'm just guessing Pastor Diane probably knows it. Pastor Diana said 5 in 500 years.
So she is probably the closest, but we have 10 copies. Tori's saying, I'm the closest with 1.
No, I'm closest with the years because I said 1,000.
Oh, yeah. So she's the closest. It's 1,000 years old, dated to 1000 AD, and we have 10 of them. Now, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a reputable historian that says the Galaic Wars didn't exist. Okay? Or that history is not reputable. All right? Guess how many Rosetta Stones we have? It's not a trick question.
1.
Guess how many Rosetta Stone we have?
1.
Yeah, there's only 1 Rosetta Stone.
Is that where you learned the new language, the Rosetta Stone?
No, I'm not talking about that. The Rosetta Stone is called the Rosetta Stone. It's 4-sided. It has the same description on all 4 sides in 4 different ancient languages, which is a pretty cool stone, but we only have 1 of them. The Code of Hammurabi, we have 3. 3 copies of the Code of Hammurabi. What?
Pastor Diana said, I had it half right. Instead of 10, she had 5. And instead of 1,009, she said she guessed 500. She goes, I just cut it in half.
There you go. All right, now for the New Testament. We're talking the 4 biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? We're going to combine them together. And the reason I say that is because the 3 synoptic gospels overlap a lot. All right? And the copies are found in the same places in collection of scrolls, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, again, I'm going to give you about a minute. I want you to guess how many different copies we have, different ancient scrolls we have, and how old the oldest ones are.
What?
Of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
I'm going to say probably 400 years old.
So you think it came out in 1600?
Sure. And like 3 copies.
You think we only have 3 copies? Okay. What about you, Tori?
I don't know.
Ancient copies. How many do you think? There are 4 books, so you know we got to have at least 4. That's 1 of each, right?
You said Matthew.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Oh, you want all 4. Diana said 1,000 years old.
Okay, so just as old. So 1000 AD, I think, is our oldest copy.
That's what she said.
All right. What do you think, Tori?
I don't know.
I only got 2 other people in this room, so you guys online got to help me out with this discussion here.
Megan says, I'm just guessing. Pastor Diana probably knows it.
So
Pastor Diana said 12 copies.
12 copies. What do you think, Tori? 12 copies is the going guess right now.
50.
50 copies. What do you think, Dorothy?
20.
20. Okay, you're all way wrong.
1.
Like massively wrong.
Okay, how many copies?
Okay. Of the 4 Gospels, the 4 biographies of Jesus of Nazareth, we have over 5,000 copies from antiquity.
I was the closest.
So,
No, Pastor Diana said
She said 12 copies.
1,500 years old.
okay,
Yeah, but-
1,500 years old, so that means our oldest one would have to be dated around 500 AD. Okay? Now, back to Plato's The Republic. 7 copies, 900 AD is the oldest copy. Okay? Caesar's Galaic Wars, 10 copies, the oldest one being 1000 AD. The New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 5,000 ancient copies, and the oldest one is dated to 50 AD.
Pastor Diana was supposed to be.
Now, if that's not a holy moly moment for you, Jesus died in 30 AD. So the oldest copy we have, recording his death, is 20 years after he died.
Mm-hmm.
That means almost everybody who actually physically saw him die was still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And people in Jerusalem knew he died. It was a pretty big deal. Mainly because, well, Rome liked to make it a public gathering when they executed people. It wasn't uncommon for them to stick people up on tree branches that were really big and publicly execute them.
Diana said no.
They were really good at it. Okay? Less than 20 years after Jesus' death is our oldest copy recording his death. And there's over 5,000 copies dated between 50 AD and 225 AD. The Council of Nicaea took place in 325 AD. So, if you think this guy Jesus of Nazareth didn't exist, then I'm going to argue Caesar never happened, Plato never happened, and pretty much everything from antiquity didn't happen. The reason I picked Plato's The Republic and Caesar's Galaic Wars is because they're the next closest in quantity. All of the ancient other documents, we either have 1 to 5 of. Like the Code of Hammurabi, we have 3. Genghis Khan, his biography is 700 years after he died.
Diana said, I mean, that it was written so soon after Christ's death, that means true witnesses knew it.
We're talking first-hand knowledge. Okay? We're not talking somebody heard from a friend who heard from a friend who heard it a friend that you've been doing whatever. Yeah, that's a reference to a really old song, Tori. Just want to put that up. Your mom might know the song, though. Yeah, that's significant. Confucius, the writings of Confucianism, Confucius, several hundred years later after he died. The biographies of Jesus, less than 20. That's amazing. So the whole point of tonight was to simply go over an overview of the Bible. That's it. We weren't going to really look at a particular section of the Bible, but simply go over what it is and why us crazy Christians read it. And this is why. I'm an evidentiarist, evidentialist, an evidentialist. So other prominent evidentialists would be Lee Strobel, J. Warner Wallace. Lee Strobel, you might know him from The Case from Christ. J. Warner Wallace, he's a forensic detective from Los Angeles, and he's known for The Evidence Demands a Verdict. Okay, and I like to look at this stuff and go, okay, why should I believe anything this stuff has to say. And yeah, that's why. Over 5,000 ancient copies, and they were all within one generation of the events they record. That's pretty significant. The reason I say that, too, this is anecdotal. In closing, I was hanging out with my dad last week. Great time. And he was telling me some stories about when I was a kid. Okay? And he didn't tell one story, but I love to tell this story. It's actually about my mom and dad and how they met. My dad and mom are still alive. If you doubt the story, you can go ask them. The reason I say that is because if John writing, or Luke writing, and his scribe compiling the stories that take place in his biography didn't happen, okay? So if Peter didn't stick his foot in his mouth, if Jesus was never crucified, if the tomb wasn't empty with Mary, Martha, and so on, right? He could distribute that, and the people who read it could go to Mary and say, "Hey, Mary, did that really happen? Hey, Peter, did you really do that? Hey."
Back on your story. Come on.
Okay. Did Judas really kill himself in a tree and then somebody found his body hanging at the bottom of the tree? Okay. They could ask. Just like my story about my mom and dad meeting, if you don't trust my story, you can go ask them for theirs, and they'll tell you. By the way, in case you didn't know, my mom and dad met at a truck stop. My dad was a cook. My mom's mom, my grandma, was a waitress and said, "Hey, Ed, you need to meet my daughter. She's a hottie, and you two would be good together." Now, my parents tell it a little bit differently, but that's essentially the gist. And my dad met my mom, and the first thing my mom said to my dad was, "You're the ugliest man I've ever met." And then she turned around and walked out of the restaurant. Again, if you don't believe me, go ask my mom and dad. They'll tell you the whole story. It's a very funny family story. I love hearing it from them. And I also like telling other people that story because it's a fun story. So that's the Christian Bible. It's been an hour or so. We're going to wrap it up and talk about next week and moving forward from here. So Tori has suggested we do something similar with 1 Corinthians, or Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, like we did with Proverbs. And I think it's a great idea. She's smiling. I think it's a great idea. I would love to do that. So starting next week, we are going to do that. We're going to do a overview of 1 Corinthians. We might do a chapter by chapter, similar to Proverbs. However, because it is a letter to a church, to a group of people, I think we might do it section by section. There's 3 major sections to the letter. So, 4 major sections to the letter, covering different things that were going on with the Christians in Corinth at the time. So I think we might do it that way and go over it over the next 3-4 weeks, rather than chapter by chapter. I think that might be a better way of doing it. Haven't fully decided. But tune in next week. Again, as soon as we're back in our building, come visit us. If you're in the Parker and Eau Claire, Emlenton area, love to have you at 6 Points Church.
If you need a ride, we'll come get you.
If you need a ride, let me know. If there is any area of the Bible you would like me to cover, you can comment here. You can head over to 90 and Out at YouTube, comment there, private message me. Talk to the other pastoral staff and leaders at 6 Points. We would love to talk to you. If you want to cover the Apocrypha, I'd love to do that too. It's kind of an interesting thing. There's not much there though. And come back next week for a discussion. I know this might sound rude, but the point of a discussion is interaction and comments. So I really do appreciate it when you all comment and engage in that. It helps me out as well. So thank you.
Diane said thank you. So informative. And Victoria Pulaski's giving you lots of hands claps.
Thank you, Victoria and Diana. Come back next week, 6:30 Eastern Time. So if you're not in the Eastern Time Zone, please check it accordingly. And I'm going to bid you all farewell. I'm Timothy Holt with 6 Points Church Youth Group. And thank you for Dorothy and Victoria for helping me out with the camera work as well as the comments. Also, big thank you to all of you who tuned in and commented.
Megan, thank
participated. So thank you. I'm going to say a little prayer, and then we are going to close out. I will respond to all of your comments later if I didn't respond to them in the video itself. So, God, you are awesome. Thank you so much for, well, creating us, first of all. Thanks for that. As well as this fascinating story about a guy named Jesus of Nazareth, your son, who saves us and takes our place, which is just so awesome. Amen.